My name is John MacDonald, and I'm here. What I want to talk about, something that Scott touched on, is about the movement towards deindustrialization and community impacts that certainly causes. One of them that I'll reflect on is a successful campaign that was held here in 2016 in order to encourage General Motors to continue to invest in an automotive facility here. It is a long history, obviously. It's interesting. I would like to show some photos, but I hadn't prepared them to show photos, but I'm looking at the photos, which is this thing. 1928, there was successful attempts or approached attempts in workers' councils. And the formation of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was still growing in the United States and throughout the world. Or in the United States, but an attempt in 1928 was not successful. Then after other successful attempts in Michigan in 1936, there was a group of workers who came here, organized again in a successful movement in 1937. We have a South Main assembly plant that was built in 1954. What I'm talking about today is the investment in that plant since 1954 to continue to manufacture cars and trucks at that facility. And leading into a round of bargaining in 2009, we were announced with the closure of a truck after those rounds of bargaining. The announcement, we were also in the preparation of building a General Motors' first hybrid truck. So it's a transformation from a post-carbon economy into another economy of fuel dependency. And so in that regard, I think we were in a good position to start moving towards some of the important keys movements throughout the world and making sure that we were reducing carbon emissions. Workers inside that plant responded in 2009 to that announcement of plant closure. We mobilized across the community. In some regards, we actually went to the headquarters of General Motors and blocked their road until they wanted to get to talks. And forced them to have a conversation about what was going to happen during our community, how they failed to communicate with the leadership of the union, and certainly what are the outcomes going forward. So we had mobilization across the community with other unions, and certainly received letters from across the world. They started to roll in support of the decision. Not in support of the decision, but in support of the action to push back and have a conversation with the plan. The outcomes of that truck plant closure led to a series of where General Motors was found by the courts of not bargaining in faith, and they paid a substantial penalty in an economic way. In 2012. There was a rush of people that left the plant. I would say thousands. If anyone can recall the number, maybe we can talk about that at the questions period. But there was thousands of workers that did leave the facility as a result of the truck plant closure. In my opinion, I think that it was a period of time in which some of the most militant people that knew the collective agreements would dig in both heels in the transformation of how work is organized. All left the plant, and it was almost like a vacuum was created, because at that point going forward, General Motors began the response by hiring people in precarious employment at much lower wages and a radical growth that took place from 2006 to at this particular period in time when the campaign was launched in 2016. That was a 10-year period. Workers were on a wage progression during that time. Some workers, many of them, took three pay cuts during that period, and then at 2016 bargaining, they achieved another 10-year growth. So workers that started in the plant in 2006 now will not reach full-time, or they're in full-time roles, but they don't reach wages of their equivalent, the person that works across from them for over 20 years. In the 2012 bargaining that led up to 2016, we thought we might have eliminated this problem. We entered that particular point. We eliminated what a process they call supplemental work employees, SWEs. The company had originally used the intent of this to launch the hybrid truck, to launch a continuation of a car that we were building in the car plant. but the 2008 economic crisis created a shortfall and a layoff. The 2012, we think we got rid of it, and then we go to bargaining, we ratify it, we come back, and then the company announces they're pulling a car out of the plant. So we respond by getting more incentives for seniority employees to leave the plant, and then continue to backfill those jobs at precarious non-seniority positions. That was the response when the Camaro launched. It went back to Lansing, Michigan, and there's a number of reports published. One that I've reflected on quite a bit is an economic impact of GM operations in Oshawa. It was written by the Center of Spatial Economics, and it's an often, we utilized it in the 2016 campaign in terms of the rank and file, the workers actually putting together a campaign with the strong support of their community, and definitely the allies of those who walked those picket lines many before to establish what we have after 81 years, our retirees. So in our campaign response, we did one thing that we know General Motors is always appalled to, and I probably will I'll reflect on this. They don't like to lose market share, right? That's where they sell. So what we did is we set up a series of banners over the 401 on Albert Street for 45 minutes a day. That's really all you need. It's reasonable for people to come out and support something for 45 minutes in a daily life. As a result of that, tens of thousands of vehicles went underneath the bridge, honking, supporting, and the odd one flipping us the finger. But you have to imagine that there is resistance, right? So in that campaign response at the bridges, as well as asking our members inside the plant and outside across communities to go and talk to their neighbors. We asked for 10 signatures. Simply have a form provided and say, go talk to your community about what impacts it could have on this community, whether it's long before and how you've came along through that abundance. This was the home of the world of the largest local union in North America. So it had tremendous economic impacts for our community and across. Gather signatures, ask your friends, and certainly ask the leaders in your community for support. We launched a political campaign that was also important, and we talked about going to those in the Ontario government as well as the federal government, key ministers, so each time that there was an email or a letter provided, those representatives would receive that. We also targeted specifically the GM executives to investment. Within that, you could provide a personal message. And in that personal message, I'll just read one from Laura. She's from Burlington. So she's not in the community, but she's certainly a supporter. She says that international corporations want to make profits in Canada, then they must pay their bills, keep their promises, and treat the Canadian workforce with dignity and not use our government like their personal piggy banks. This is exactly what was particularly happening in that case. We had the Canadian public had set aside taxation, their money that was to go to the programs to raise the standards across the community and the country, and take that money and give it to one of the richest corporations in the world. Certain numbers of stories broke out across the Detroit News, obviously talking about what was transpiring in Oshawa and the talks with General Motors in Canada. I'll also talk about Dakota. And so Dakota, she wrote this, that GM must invest and commit to Oshawa. My family, as well as thousands of others, will be at risk of losing their homes and more. We need the government to step up to the plate. So this was the political pressure that was required to put on that of those who wrote the check, essentially. The Canadian government made a substantial contribution to General Motors to get them through a period of time, and yet they fail it. They just take the money and leave after basically 4 years. So we also started to reach out to our communities, the places that all of us go as consumers and contributors of services in the community. That's a key point that sometimes often doesn't get reflected, I think, or often gets left out of the discussions that we have. Is that some in business can say, okay, that's you know, those workers or this and that. The problem is that we're also contributors. We go to people to buy products at the grocery stores. We also hire someone to come in and do services. So there's a lot of key reflection that the economy is deeply ingrained in one another. And you also have to support the people who certainly contribute to that. We obviously have great allies and support, and I touched on that, of all of those who have walked those picket lines and fought those battles for 81 years to establish the high standards that were achieved. And that didn't come easy, obviously. Many bitter picket lines, but the day-to-day challenges that we put on. We created the signs, as I mentioned. We sent a delegation of people into Toronto where bargaining talks had been happening. But we continue to put pressure over the bridge by having highlights of drawing attention to what was taking place in the country, and specifically in Oshawa. We provided the outcomes. We got the equinox was removed. That's not good. We have tremendous support that came from the City Council and towards moving General Motors and to plug General Motors in towards General Motors in Oshawa happening to be a great location to do investment in electric vehicles. We have one of the best engineering groups. We have intellectual development in technology that is taking place in Ontario. It's a major hub, and Ontario is a key place. But as we move into the future, the bad news is that there isn't additional investment. The fight of this campaign led to General Motors committing to build a truck. And so they kind of returned the truck, but in a different capacity. We don't actually stamp the truck or make the truck in its full form. We simply just follow off the components that are in overlap from that of the in the United States. So we continue to fight for the future and do your part. That's what we would ask people to do. We got lots of support from security firms as well. So we weren't, certainly no one from the company was pushing back in that regard. I think that they certainly felt the pressures that were underway. We began Facebook groups, and that's kind of a contentious piece because you know, the use of social media in that component can reach some. So where we simply started with a group of about 200 people, our posts were, by the end of the campaign, reaching over 900,000 people. And that ramped up, I believe, a number of online pieces when we didn't see people on a bridge. We've seen people online, and there was tremendous support from them. The outcomes, though, are remarkably different because in 2016, those workers who had faced precarity in that employment were then recognized. So they had 10 years of work there, but no recognition of their service. And as we move forward, they're $14 less than the counterpart across from them. So what that does internally is it creates tremendous stress in the workplace. You're not sure if you necessarily feel the same or if you're even addressed the same. And Ed touched on it in the movements that took place in this particular city, where a group of women led a fight in 1968 to have separate seniority lists in the plan eliminated. They went on to get a member of provincial parliament to make substantial changes to then affect no separate seniority lists in the province of Ontario. And yet there's a trend that we simply are falling back on where the what workers' contributions towards their labor is not reflected equally. I think that's something that we're going to continue working on going into the future. General Motors bargaining is up in 2020. We applied some of these principles in the Success of a 15 in Fairness campaign. I see some allies that work very hard in going door to door and talking to people in our community about raising the bar, raising the standards for all, and as a result, connecting the community to the common things that we share.